We've got Caroline here with us, our judge for tonight, Caroline Preece.
Hi.
She's only really with us because of Zoom. Had we been asking her to judge a competition, I doubt she'd want to drive all the way up to Lancaster.
You definitely wouldn't want the petrol.
yeah, we'd be stung for travelling costs. But because of Zoom, we can go all over the country. So Caroline lives in London and West Sussex, if I've got that correct. She's a member of Lawton Camera Club. She's a licentiate member of the Royal Photographic Society. And she's been judging for about 2 years.
Yeah, about 2 years.
Just 2 years.
Yes, yeah.
So that's Caroline. We're going to kick off with the colour images, with 52 colour images. And then we're going to have a 10-minute break. And then we'll go on to the 47 mono. So I'd like to welcome you, Caroline. And the floor is now yours.
Great, thank you. First of all, thank you everyone for inviting me. One of the great things about Zoom is you can travel all over the countryside. I also get to see that means images from different areas of the world. I mean, for us down south, Dungeness is incredibly popular. I've never been there. I feel like I actually have. So it's great to see different bits of the world. Here, first of all, you've given us a sort of very simple graphic image called Wall Street. The title here is useful in terms of leading me as the judge or the viewer to what you want me to look at, what you want me to focus on. Obviously, it's that road running through. It creates a good leading line, taking you through to hills in the background, with a barn in the foreground, creating some foreground interest. What I would think about, however, is with an image, the more you have in an image, the more you dilute its impact. Would it have been stronger? Whilst the most interesting light is on the hills in the background, that's only a very focus my attention on that. Would it have been better to crop off the top part of the image around sort of here? So if you get rid of that, what does that all do? So annotate. It's like giving a 5-year-old a crayon. It's brilliant to try and explain what you want to do, even though I'm not very neat with it. But by taking that top part of the image, then it really focuses your attention onto the actual lower part of the image and actually increase the impact of it. So I think you've got an interesting concept. I like that stone structure. I like how you've actually created a foreground to the middle ground leading line taking to the wall going up the hill. But potentially a little less in the image could have actually strengthened the impact of the main ingredients of it. 16.
Anissa Sadat.
This girl I liked a lot. I think the lighting on it works really, really well, highlighting the tips of the images. You've just got a hint of highlights on the water without them being distracting. One of the things, and I think the position of the wings and the way you've caught it, the moment you've caught it in, works very effectively. One of the things to think about when taking this sort of photo is what does the position in the photo, how does the position in the photo impact your psychological experience of viewing it? Here you've got the gull towards the bottom of the actual image. What would you expect to see? Well, actually you expect to see gulls flying up above you. You expect to see space below them. Also, when it comes to composition, if you think about when you mount prints, often you'll have a smaller space if you're doing something like an uneven mount, a smaller space at the top and larger space at the bottom because it's visually aesthetically more pleasing. So I think perhaps if you change the balance of where he is in the frame, it would have worked slightly better. However, that said, there's an awful lot to like about him. I'm holding him back. Here, very much, it's first of the autumn photos, very much of the season we're going into. The leaves are changing. It's a busy, chaotic, it's quite a busy, chaotic image with a lot going on there. When you take one of these busy images with a lot going on, you've got all the various bushes and leaves. What works best with those is trying to instill an element of structure in it, something to actually hold you as a viewer. So you'll find quite often even the most chaotic images often have that just element of structure you can see within, just to ground yourself. The stones themselves are not necessarily strong enough as a focal point for that. However, I like the fact that you've actually shown part of the image. You haven't intended to show the whole thing. When you take photos, it's all very much about what your response is to what you see. You're not trying to take a photo of something, you're trying to take a photo about something. What was your response? What made you take that photo? What moved you? And here it's very obviously about the colour of the autumn leaves. 15.
Colin Rogers.
Yeah, we've got a rather handsome little chap here. I think what works well is obviously no distracting elements in the background. You've got a catchlight in the eye, making him look alert. One of the things to be conscious of when you have birds on branches is how bright is the actual branch they're actually sitting on. There's something called visual intensity, visual weight. And this is the thing, this is what makes objects stand out. What draws your eye to them. Here, the branch is contrasting to the green of the background and the greyish colour of the bird. But on the branch, you've also got some bright green algae. The orangey brown of the branch is quite saturated. Your eye tends to go saturated points, your eye tends to go to bright areas, your eye tends to go to areas of contrast. All of that means that the branch is fighting with the bird for attention. One of the things you need to think about when taking an image is imagine you're having, on stage, you have two divas on the stage. Well, you can't have two divas on the stage, they just fight. You have the main subject, and then nothing should be competing with the main subject for attention. It's like you have a star on the stage and the rest is the background cast. If you have two divas, they elbow each other out of the way. So, I mean, whilst the bird is really, really nice, it's really well done, I think potentially if you just desaturated the branch he's actually sitting on, that would have increased the impact of the bird and actually increased the impact of the image itself. That said, it's picking holes because you have captured the bird well, but it's just looking at how can you actually get the maximum bang for your buck out of your image. 17.
Gary Barton.
Here, you obviously seen these wrecks. It's always very tempting from a photographer's point of view to ruin, decay. It's all very interesting. I don't know what it is about us, but we're all drawn to it. And here you've caught these two interesting wrecks slowly decaying and mouldering within the landscape. When you process something, think about how you want the viewer to view it emotionally. A lot of processing of photography is related to the psychology behind it. How do you influence a viewer? How do you actually make them feel what you want them to feel? What story does the elements tell? Here you have you've got the bright green leaves, the bright yellowy orange of the weeds around here. You've got the reflections all there. It's actually what you've presented, a really quite cheerful scene. And one of the questions to ask yourself is, do I really want to present a really cheerful, happy, bright scene? Or is that actually in line with decay and actually these wrecks mouldering? Does that actually fit the story itself? And it very much depends what you want to say. You might want to show the wrecks in this bright, cheerful scene, but you may want to emphasize that if you actually desaturated everything a little bit more, took some of the colour out, that would remove some of the cheerful effect, and then you would actually emphasise the feeling of decay within the image, because decay is not necessarily bright and cheerful. But I think the angle works well that you shot them at, and I enjoy the leading line coming up to the actual boats themselves, get the water going through. 16.
Carol Weatherly.
And silver birch trees make absolutely great subjects. Here, I think what works really, really well is the contrast of the birch trees and the delicateness of them against the actual rocks themselves. One of the things to think about, mind you, talking about visual weight, is what do you want me as the viewer to look at? What do you want the main story to be? Here, the largest part of the image itself is these rocks. They are very attractive rocks. They've got great texture and detail. I love all that. I'm assuming that's gorse on them. It's got some good light in them. Is that where you want my main focus to be, or do you want my main focus to be on the trees? And this is something which you, as a photographer, need to make the decision in post-processing. I can't say where your actual focus is. For me, by the fact that this is dark, it's dominant, and it's the largest area in the frame, that's when my attention goes to the rocks and the gorse, and less so to the actual silver birch trees. I think what works well is the fact that you've either got fog, mist, or sort of recessed hills in the background. That creates good separation and creates depth in the image. 17.
Ken McGrath.
Fake news. Here what you've given us is a very conceptual image. One of the important things about photography, as I mentioned before, is doing an image about something, not of something. Here it's very much clearly a response to the situation in the world today in terms of the media, and this is how you've chosen to interpret it. I think the individual ingredients are very well thought out. Is it the torn newsprint? You've just got that element of numbers there. You've got the word issues there. And obviously you've got Donald Trump's face in the middle. And that all very clearly tells the story. I think possibly this bit in the foreground is, whilst it's out of focus, it's also quite bright. And because it's quite bright, it does act as a distracting element. So to further increase the impact and stop having it fighting with Donald Trump's face, I suggest possibly darkening that down. However, I think it's a very good image, it's a very creative image, it's a very, very well thought out image, so I'm holding it back. Yeah. Here we have a riot of colour. I'm not sure about only in Japan. I've been out on many a night in London and it's gone a bit like this as well. There's the odd occasion where the place which is supposed to be doing fancy dress every weekend stopped and we're just wandering around town in fancy dress. London, no one actually looks. It'd be very hard in London to get noticed. We even have something called the naked bike ride. I don't know if you've seen it. It's a bit weird. It's the best way to describe it. So here you've got this figure, he's partying, he's celebrating, he's got googly eyes on. You're looking at him from the side, however. How can you get better impact? By looking at something from the side, you're taking the position of an observer, a person watching on. If you were able to get a slightly more forward sideways angle, so more 45 degrees to the front, you start then becoming more part of the scene. You're less looking on. Psychologically, you become more part of the scene, more part of the party, and that would actually involve you to a greater extent in the image. I think it's a well seen, fun image. I'll give it a 15.
Daniel Stott.
Fabulous fungi. When I looked at them on the run through, very much they reminded me of a fabulous wig or Cousin It from the Addams Family. Either one, they've got their own personality and character. And I can see very much why you've chosen to photograph them. You have, however, taken quite, you're looking down on them from above and the lighting feels quite flat. With fungi, what a lot of people do is they'll take a much lower viewpoint, but also they use artificial lighting. I'd say probably about at least 90% of the strongest fungi images do have an element of artificial lighting brought into them, because where fungi grow is often not the greatest area for light source. But I think you've got a good simple background around. You've got the leaves and the texture of the forest floor. So there's nothing really distracting. It all tells part of the story. 15.
Jan Kent.
Here you've given us a reenactment scene. The couple holding hands. I think they work well against the sort of dark browny red of the train. They stand out nicely. I think it's important to pay attention to details. We have this little gentleman's reflection in the actual glass here. Yeah, he doesn't really add to the story, bless him. He might think he's important, but he's not really what we want to look at. So I just think about, you could have just cropped him, could have cloned or just cropped him off here to get rid of him. Also, a little tip with regards to them, it's obviously as a reenactment scene, it's quite posed. They're looking at probably another photographer. It's actually, when dealing with these things, it is really hard to get good photos, good photos is the wrong word, natural looking photos. What you want to do is try and get them to engage with each other, try and have a much more greater connection with them, catch them in the in-between moments where they're not necessarily posing for the photograph, but there's a much more natural connection. That said, I mean, the lighting works well on them. I mean, it's a nice technically executed photo. It's just trying to put that, other than attention to detail, it's just trying to put that element of personality onto it, make it feel more natural, less staged, more real. 16.
Graham Harvey.
Yeah, I really like this image. It's very contemporary in feel. It's the sort of thing you'd expect to see in the likes of Instagram and such like. I'm really enjoying all the sort of the darkness and desaturated nature of the road, and just got these bright highlights from the bike lights coming through. And you've got the light coming off the cars. One of the challenges you face, however, is you're photographing into the sun, morning rush hour, so that'd be the sunrise. And you've almost got two images here. You've got this desaturated dark image down the bottom, and then you've got this bright area of sky up here with, you've got the reds and the burnt out areas, and your eye goes to the brightest area of the image, your eye goes to the most saturated area in the image, and yellows and reds attract your eye. So there's a tendency for focus to be on this bit as opposed to the bottom bit. What I would say is, if you're ever in the situation to try do something again, think about where the sun is. Could you get the sun behind you? Which would make it a less distracting element of it. But I think that the idea works really well. I like the fact you've done something quite contemporary and modern in feel, and there's a lot to like about it. 18.
Dan Johnson.
Looking out, yeah. I'm not the world's greatest at nature photography. I'm going for Crow, could be something similar. You have, I think you've caught him well. I like the fact that you've tried to do something a little bit different. So you've got him standing on an edge of some bank or cliff, looking out at the water beyond. So you try to create a story there, which is good. You're looking through the grass in the foreground, which creates a sense of depth and sort of 3D-ness within the image. What I would suggest is having that foreground that a little bit more out of focus, so it's a little bit less distracting, and having more space around the bird because he feels a little bit cramped in frame. If you're interested in shooting through elements to the foreground and creating a slightly different angle and view, there's a photographer which I always think is well worth looking at, Ben Hall. He does a lot of sort of out of focus foreground shooting to an animal. His images are amazing. And even if you just want to have a look at them, I'd thoroughly recommend it. But I think it's a good idea. I really like the fact you tried to do something different approach, different creative. You tried to create a story there. 16.
Caroline Phillips. Caroline Phillips.
Here, so you've given us an attractive portrait of goldfinch. Technically is well done. You've got the catchlight in the eye. Nothing distracting within the background. As with the other bird, however, you have the stickies standing on, contrasting to the background and being quite bright. And it's also quite textured with the plant, algae, lichen, which is growing on it. and this distracts attention from the bird itself. The rest of the tones of the whole image, the bird's always wonderful warm reds and yellows, and then you've got the green of the actual stick at a lighter tone. So that, we're talking about having 2 stars, that's competing with the attention for the bird. You want the viewer to maximise the impact, you want the viewer to focus entirely on the bird. So once again, think about desaturating and darkening it slightly, so there's nothing which pulls my attention away from actually the bird itself. 18.
Mike Atkinson.
Here you've given us a really interesting triptych. I'm really enjoying all the light within that. Dark shade, all these lines running throughout it are really interesting and just creates a sense of energy and dynamism. Contrast, one of the things to look at when you're doing an image is visual intensity, and that's how the various different compositional elements work together to actually create an image which is not overpowering and is not boring to look at. Contrast is one way to interject visual intensity into a simple image, which you've done very well here, as is with this red section in the middle, which once again is very, very effective. It just creates energy, it lifts. You can imagine that image without the red, it wouldn't have stood out so much, it wouldn't be so impressive. One of the things I'd think about is, can you start creating a connection between the 3 elements? So here you've got the tape going out the top, but then it's not, could you have had it coming into the bottom and then doing something to this one? And that would have started joining the 3 different elements together and creating and just building on a more coherent whole. But I really like it. I think it's well thought out. It's a lot of really positive elements. 18.
Reg Haslam.
Here I think you've got some really good storytelling in the image itself. Compositionally works well. You've created a very clear foreground, middle ground, and background. Photography is 2D. One of the challenges we always face is how do we turn that 2D image into something which is 3D? How do we give it depth? And here you've got very clear, controlled the viewer's eyes through the logs in the foreground. Then you go to the tree in the middle ground, and then through the deforestation to the area of the background. So that's well done. The light itself feels a little bit bright and contrasty, and these logs have taken on a slightly unnatural feeling tone, as has potentially this bit of grass there. And it's just looking at toning it down a little bit. This may be what it looks like in real life. It may be exactly what it looked like, but from a viewer's point of view, you want the image to look actually believable. But I think it's well done. 18.
Carol Weatherly.
Once again, you've given us a really autumnal scene. You've got the strong leading line taking you through to the mountains in the background. The fact that the path is so much brighter than the actual mountains makes it a clear focal point, so that works well. One of the things I think about is your path is actually quite long. What's the most interesting part of the image? Is it actually the path, or is it actually where the path goes? And if you think about how you view it, your eye will follow the path through all the way, and it's actually quite a long journey for the eye to go through. Do you need quite as much of a journey? If you cropped it off the bottom half, so you take this bottom half off, you've actually shortened the journey you go on. You've still got the clear leading line, but it actually makes the image more dynamic. It brings more energy to it. And generally strengthens the overall feel of it. I think it's well done, well seen. I'll give that an 18.
Kevin Gilpin.
Here, once again, another autumnal feeling image by the use of the colour palette, the oranges and yellows. I feel she almost feels like she's part of a pagan ritual, a pagan rite with that headdress on her head. I think your crop works very effectively. When you take the top off of a model's head or headdress in this case, what you do is you actually focus the attention on the eyes. as with the tight crop in the bottom, it's very clear now. The more you have in an image, the more you dilute it. By taking the top and bottom off, you've taken out any distracting elements. There's only one place for me as a viewer to go, and that's to her eyes and her mouth. So I think that works very, very effectively. You've just got sense of out of focus background there, just creating space. One of the challenges is, when working with models, is the hands. Often there's a position they'll go in, which I think that's because a soft hand makes it more attractive, but often it actually looks quite unnatural. Here, hands quite light, and it's almost slightly claw-like onto her face. And I think what the challenge is, how do we actually make the hands look natural? Could you give her a chance to play with her hair a little bit more, or do something more with it? Or even possibly just darken the hand down a little bit so it's less bright in the image. But I think overall it's well done, 17.
Tina Cordukes.
Here you've got a very simple image. There's a very harmonious colour palette. One of the challenges you often see with insect photography is the flower dominates. But here the colour's burgundy, which complements the actual colours in the actual moth, as does the background complement. So there's nothing fighting for attention or trying to actually dominate the moth itself. The position in the frame works well. You've got it slightly off and slightly diagonal in feel. And with diagonal lines create a sense of energy in the image. They create a sense of travel. Something I'm very much into is psychology of composition. So horizontal lines are the most stable, vertical is slightly more dynamic, and diagonal lines are the most dynamic with an image. So when you've got actually a really simple image, putting something on the diagonal can actually instill that sense of image and the sense of energy, and actually makes a simple image more engaging to the viewer. That one I'm holding back. Yeah, here, very much, it's very obvious why you took this photo. I mean, he's so cute, he's so fluffy. He's really, really, I mean, you've got great texture and detail in the feathers. You just want to go and, not that you can actually snuggle a small bird, but you do just want to go and snuggle him. Once again, we talked about colours dominating. Here, you've got a lot of bright greens around. They all start fighting for attention for me as the viewer and with the bird. If you desaturated all of the greens slightly, and we're not talking about totally, but just take out some of the saturation from them, they will be less intense. One of the things your eyes go to in an image is heavily saturated areas. So all of this in particular is very, very saturated and will compete against the browns of the bird. Also, I think we talked about position in frame and how do we create energy in an image. There's nothing wrong with having something, he's relatively central in the image. There's nothing wrong per se of having something that's central in the image, but central is a very static position. And if you have something very central in the image, you need other factors in that to compensate for that, to introduce energy. Here, I think if you just had him slightly more to the edge of the image, you start building in some dynamic tension to that and just increase the impact of the actual image itself. But I think it's well done. It's technically well done. You've got great catchlight in his eyes, and in subject matter, he's just absolutely adorable. 16.
Kirsty Railton.
Here, you caught a great moment. It's so much, especially things like nature photography. Photography is storytelling. And the best nature images are the ones which actually have real action, emotion, natural behaviour, ones which actually, it's not just a bird sitting there doing a portrait of a bird, but something that actually gets you feeling what the bird's like, what their life is like. Here you've caught a great moment. He's just reaching around, stealing that berry. Unfortunately, he said it's through the kitchen window. You've faced a challenging situation. You probably only had a fraction of a second to grab this. So he's actually slightly soft, and you've got these sort of fairly bright distracting elements here, the sharpest area being the berries. Why does it matter he's soft? Well, your eye goes to the sharpest part of the image. So my eye will be drawn to the berries, and actually what you want me to focus on, what you want me to look at, is the bird itself. So in terms of visual hierarchy, my eye will go to the berries and then they'll go to him. But I think it's a great moment captured. Keep an eye out on that kitchen window. Have a camera there ready to, because if they've done it once, they're going to do it again. And the more times you get that, the more times you capture him, the more chances you are of having him sharp and the berries less so, or the berries equally sharp. 16.
Alison Townley.
Here, very harmonious image you've given us. The greens and the purples, strong contrasting colours, working well with the background which mirrors the colour scheme. We talked about diagonals. Here, the plant is very much on the diagonal, which injects a sense of energy and dynamism into a very simple image. If you imagine so the plant had been straight or a plant had been vertical, it wouldn't have been as appealing to actually look at. The lighting works well on it, and I'll hold it back. Oops, get rid of that. Old Packhorse Bridge. Earlier on we talked about the importance of when you're actually taking photograph, having a viewpoint. What's your response to the situation? Not trying to take the whole scene, but actually what made you take, really thinking about what made you take that photo and honing in on that element. So you don't necessarily photograph something, you photograph your response to it, the bit which actually you get really passionate about and excites you about. Here, you've done this well. You've cropped off, guessing that's an aqueduct or similar. You've cropped off the top of that, and attention very much focused to the bridge here. The bridge itself, it's great texture, great shape. It's something from a time gone by. It's still impressive. It's still standing. What I would think about, there's two elements I think about with this. But first of all, we talked about your eye going to the sharpest part of the image. Unfortunately, the aqueduct or whatever that is behind the bridge is actually sharper than the bridge itself, which basically means when I look at the image, my attention goes here, and this is just a backup. So this will be because it's sharpest and the brightest part, lightest. This will be the star. This will be the supporting cast. Is that really how you wanted me to view the image? By the title, I assume you'd want me to view this first and then have this as the background. Other thing I think about is just, do we need this bit at the side? If you took that bit off the side, it focus attention very much more onto the actual bridge and the stream itself. As I said, the more you have an image, the more it dilutes the impact. But I think I really enjoyed the angles that you photographed it at. I think what you've done really, really well here, and it's something everyone has to learn as photographers, is to just take part of an image. Don't try and take the whole thing, but really hone your vision, and you've done that very, very well. 17.
Steve Weatherly. You're saying that you don't need that. The focus was wrong.
Yeah. Personal airspace.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting title. Very tight crop to the plane. I think what works really well is you have the propeller, you've got movement in the propeller. That gives a sense of motion. Unfortunately, when the tight crop actually works against the actual movement of the propeller, when you take a photograph of something moving, it's important to have space for it to move into or move out of. And this, once again, it comes down to psychology and how you perceive things. Because short psychology, you create an implied line of travel, and where there's no space for him to fly into, he kind of looks like he's about to go and drop out of the sky, which is probably not what he's about to do. You've got him turning by the actual angle of the wings. I'd imagine you've actually got him as he's banking to the right, he's about to turn to the right. So if you could have given him a little bit more space there and a little bit more space above, you'd have actually given him space to turn around into and move into. The fact that you crop the bottom of the wings off, that doesn't bother me at all. It's just giving him that space to actually move and fly through. but I think it's well done. It's a challenge is getting the propellers to actually get the right shutter speed for the propellers. You don't want them to disappear entirely, but you want just enough of a blur to actually create that sense of motion and movement. So I think that was done well. 16. Surfing on Bondi Beach. Yeah, Bondi Beach would be really nice given that we're coming onto the winter. Or anything warm and sunny would be wonderful. Depressing thing is Australia's coming into the summer now. Here, it's a sports photography, it's a sports image. One of the things about sports images is it's all about storytelling. It's all about the moment. It's that connection, a sense of actually being here. Here, you can see his face. You can see his eyes, you can see his focus. It starts conveying the actual emotion of what he's at, of the absolute concentration as he cuts through the actual sea itself. There's probably lots of technical surfing terms I have literally no idea about, but that will do. You've got good spray in the water and no distracting elements. The one thing I'd say, however, is be careful about over sharpening. Here, he almost looks like he's actually drawn or cut in. It's the challenge of too much sharpening and too much clarity is it can look unnatural. Sometimes cameras themselves, modern cameras, are just so sharp. You almost need to look at possibly taking about a little bit of negative clarity, a little bit of negative texture, just to actually make it look more realistic and more believable. But I think it's very well captured, very good moment. 18. Grasmere. And this is where I start to get to see the rest of the world. Loughton, my camera club, we had a competition against Australia a few weeks back. I got really excited thinking, oh, I can see lots of interesting bits of Australia. Yeah, there's lots of flowers and indoor shots. And I know nothing more about Melbourne, unfortunately, but they had a great shot of Patagonia. But there went my international travel attempts while staying at home. Here, very peaceful, tranquil scene with the reflections of the boats on the water. The diagonal coming through works very well. That creates, as I said, diagonal lines create a sense of energy. What I would think about once again is distracting elements. Your eye, talked about eye going to very saturated parts. The background here is very green. Because it's one of the most saturated areas of the image, that's where your eye actually gets pulled up to. That's where your eye actually goes. Do you want me as a viewer to focus on that element, or is the main story in the foreground here? The saturation of that is further exaggerated because you'd actually have a leading line taking me up to the very green element. But once again, that's something which is it's a minor thing in terms of it can be easily fixed in post. I think the fact that you've actually done a really, the crop here works very effectively because you've taken out the distracting elements. You've just got a sense of this is where the bank is and what the bank's like. And you've created a boundary around the lake itself, but you don't have anything distracting and competing with the boats other than the colour. 17.
Stephen Worrell.
Here, I like the fact you tried to do something different. I think it's an interesting crop. What I'd almost say is, could you have been actually braver with a crop even and gone even further? If you're going to go large. So here you've cropped off very tight above its head. We talked about a model and how if you crop the top of their head, it focuses your attention more on their eye. Could you have actually even cropped even further through there, just to bring your attention and possibly more on the bottom, which would make him jump out of the frame even more? It's the question of if you do something, don't do it by halves, commit to it. Then if you've taken the top and bottom off, your attention really focuses in on the beak and just the eyes. That's the main part of the photo. What I would say, however, is unfortunately the beak is actually sharper than the eyes. What you'd actually want, human beings, the way they look at an animal or a person, is you go to the eyes first. The eyes are the bit that you expect to see sharp and you want to see sharp. It could have been your intention that the beak would be sharp in the eyes. It could be where actually that's where you want my main focus to be, on the beak. I would have expected it to be in the eyes, but it very much depends on your own personal artistic vision within that. But I love the fact that you've actually done something different, and different angle, different approach to it. 16.
Carolyn Phillips.
Here, as I say, title Summer Tree. I think you've got a really attractive, I can see why you took the image. It's amazing sky, it's wonderful reflection in the water itself. As it is, where does your eye go? By the fact the title Summer Tree, it makes me think that actually the tree's the main area of focus. But as it is, my eyes just go and appreciate the focus on the clouds and the reflection. One of the things you can do when you actually have it at home, you see the images in advance, is to have a little play. And I think what you're faced with very challenging conditions when you sort of took this image. When you've got a really bright sky like that, you've got a very high dynamic range, and your camera will struggle to actually have the landscape itself exposed and the sky exposed as well correctly. So there's two ways about this. A, take several shots and merge them. Take one for the brightness of the sky, one for the brightness of the landscape. Or in something like Lightroom, which I did at home, was just pull the shadows up. And if you pull the shadows up and actually brighten all this landscape, it makes it stand out a lot more, and the subject then becomes the tree with this wonderful sky around, as opposed to the sky with a very dark tree in the background. I think your choice of long exposure, slow shutter speed worked very well with the sky. It really created this very attractive shapes and lines of the actual clouds themselves, and they all focus in, they create a focal point around the tree itself. So I think it's well done, well seen, but it's challenging circumstances to take the image, and it's challenging circumstances to take the image, so it's looking at how can you actually go and fight the environment. You've seen something good. The challenge is actually seeing and actually having the vision. Then it's just the technical bit you can just catch up with. The important thing is the actual vision itself, and I think you've done that well. 14. Here, yeah, very cute little bird. So you do have him cropped quite tightly in the frame. However, with birds and wildlife images, it's good to actually have a little bit more space around them, a little bit more sense of the environment they're in. I like the directness of his gaze. Really, he looks like he's staring you as a photographer down. It's a decided staring match. And I think there's nothing distracting in the background, which works well. 18.
Christine Armstrong.
Here, hares are gorgeous, and there's more and more of them around now. I was walking around the Downs the other day, and I was like, oh, someone's let their dog off the lead. We've got lots of sheep there, you really shouldn't do it. It was like, that looks like a Jack Russell. I wasn't wearing my glasses at the time. As it got closer, I don't think that's a Jack Russell. Could be a Yorkshire Terrier. Got a bit closer, and I was like, damn, that's a hare running down the path at me. Unfortunately, the hare realised that I'm a human at the same time and disappeared off at the side, so I got a really bad photo of it. But they're definitely, I mean, they were very rare. There's getting a lot more of them out there now, which is absolutely brilliant. Here, I think it's a really attractive image of the hare. Doesn't matter that you've cropped his bottom off. He's got a gorgeous expression in the eye. It's very sort of Watership, even though Watership Down was about rabbits, it's got a slightly Watership Down it. You do have a lot of space here to the left, however. Now, I like negative space, but the image needs to be balanced. And I was wondering, if you actually just, especially as you've cropped his bottom off, if you just cropped off a little bit more on that side, more of a square crop, you create a slightly more balanced image and actually increase the impact of the hair itself. But I really do like him. I'll hold him back. Yeah, this is another advantage of actually seeing images in advance and judging by zoom. I could actually look up what an orrery is. I'm not sure I can pronounce it correctly, but I now know what it is. For those who are not aware, it's the mechanical model of the solar system. And this is where titles can be really important, because it's quite a conceptual image in itself. And without the title, I wouldn't have necessarily, okay, I'm looking at abstract, I wouldn't have necessarily known, however, what the actual photographer had in mind. But once you've actually given the title, you immediately suddenly click on to actually, yeah, that's the sun or a star going around and the various different levels of the solar system. It suddenly all makes sense. It's interesting, everyone's interpretation is different. I think of that as a sun, which basically it goes around something dark, which could be the Earth, which we're kind of getting into the flat earther territory. But apart from that, we're not getting for astrological perfection. I really like the tones in it. I like the texture. I think the gold here is really important, as with the orange, because it just lifts the image, provides energy, and creates it and makes it engaging to look at. I think the square crop works very well, emphasising the actual shapes of all the circles around. I give that an 18.
Alan Phillips.
Here, Garden of Unearthly Delights. Here's a very abstract image. I mentioned before something about visual intensity, and this is, when you look at an image, how does it feel? Does it hold your attention? Does it feel slightly overwhelming? Here is a very visual intense image. There's lots of pattern, there's lots of texture, there's lots of saturation, there's lots of bright colours. And from a viewer's point of view, it does feel slightly overpowering. I think one of the challenges of this sort of competition is not every image works well in a sort of the standard sort of camera club competition. So this I can imagine either as a really large canvas somewhere in a big room, something you can stand back and actually real view, or as part of a triptych where you explore the scene further and you have different images of this type. So I think the creativity and idea is good. 16.
Alan Phillips.
Here, let's get a lovely restful seascape. I think you've done very well in terms of making it very clear what you're looking at. Often it's tempting to include lots of sky and lots of sea and lots of landscape. And then from a viewer's point of view going, well, what do you want me to look at? What's the priority here? Here, by your crop, you've made it very clear that it's the sea and the land that I want to look at. The sky, you've got it there, but it's part of the scenery, it's part of the background of the stage. The star of the image is this whole very badly drawn rockscape coming through. It's interesting, because you've taken this from quite high up. I assume you're on a cliff. Often high up diminishes the size or something. But here, I think the angle works well because you've got this tiny little lighthouse hanging off the edge of the actual rocky outcrop, dwarfed by these big cliffs around it, especially this one. It really creates a sense of fragility of man within the landscape itself. However, I think one of the things to do is you go to a situation, you go to an environment, there's what you initially see and respond to, but then it quite often pays to hone in and actually look, is there anything else in that scene? Is there anything else I can get an image out of? And here, one of the things about this image is you've got some fabulous light going across the actual cliffs themselves. It's really bringing out the texture and colours. So I almost wonder if you've actually got another image, which is very badly drawn, around there. I'm taking that bit, like really badly drawn, because what you have then is you've got the sea, and you've got this wonderful texture of the cliff, the wonderful colours coming up, and the light coming across, and then just the sea going around that. And that itself was actually, whilst your original image is a very attractive image, really, you've done well to convey the feeling of smallness of man within the landscape. Here, you've really honed in on a section of the landscape itself, and actually you'd make the most of all the actual the lighting and the drama of that. But overall, I think it's well done. 17.
Ken McGrath.
Here, very attractive sunscape. I think what works well is the recessing of the mountains into the background with the gentle mist or fog or low cloud across them. It creates a sense of depth in the image. It makes the image feel 3D. We're talking about visual intensity itself. We do have very even pattern. The hills all mirror each other. The colours are very harmonious, and landscape crops are actually quite low energy. It's really interesting to see what impact different sorts of crops have on actually the feeling of an image. Landscape crops tend to be quite calm. How does the viewer view the image? Go all the way across, back, and then across there. Portrait crop if this was a portrait crop, it creates a much more dynamic viewing experience, because you tend to view the image much more like that. And where you have a very peaceful, calm, attractive scene like that, possibly doing something in a portrait crop rather than a landscape crop, creates a bit more dynamic tension with the image itself. And we talked about it creates a bit more visual intensity, which makes it more engaging for the viewer itself. So it's a very pleasant scene that you've seen. I definitely know why you took a photograph of it, but can you give it that little bit more energy, a little bit more dynamic tension, just to make me not just look at it and go, oh, that's a really nice, attractive scene, but actually stop and look and actually spend some more time with it. 17.
Gary Barton.
Reflection, yeah, very much about the reflection. I think what always works well is snow, so you've simplified the background, and it's just got this gentle colours of the actual undergrowth and the tree and the reflection itself. Would it have worked better with some landscape around it? Possibly, so you've got a bit more sense of space in the environment itself. The reflection is quite bright and mirrors the tree at the top. One of the things to think about this is typically reflections look darker than the actual objects themselves. Also, when you look at visual hierarchy, where do you want the viewer to look first? Where do you want the viewer to look second? When you have two very equal elements, both parts of the image actually compete for the attention. So here, my eye will flip between the reflection, the tree and the reflection. Further emphasised by the fact that the actual horizon is very central and each part has actually got pretty equal space around it. So it's a question of, from your vision, what do you want the viewer to look at? What do you want the viewer to focus on? And how do you crop and tone it to emphasise that element? And it could be as a photographer, you go, actually, I want the viewer's eye to bounce between the two elements. And that's actually a visual choice. 17.
Tina Cordukes.
Cloudy day. Yeah, very much. You sort of seen the clouds. You've and it's sort of prompted you to take the image. The clouds themselves are very attractive. You've got some great shapes in there, some great colours. You've got the clock tower as foreground to the clouds. I wonder whether, by the fact the title is Cloudy Day, how much importance of the image is the actual clock tower itself. I almost wonder whether you could have actually gone a little bit further and been a little bolder with this. If you wanted the stars of the photo to actually be the clouds, could you have made it actually a more minimalist image? Some very, very minimalist images will just, I'm just going to draw it there, we'll just have the scene there and then just a small, the element very small within the frame. So just providing that little accent to the image itself, but actually not. But actually here, the clock tower itself is quite dominant and it actually attracts my eye more than the clouds itself. If the clock tower itself is really important to you, what I would think about is how can you actually separate it from the background, and potentially sort of a lower viewpoint looking at, do these grassy areas add to the story? Do they take it away? everything that you include in the photograph, the viewer will think is actually intentional. So do you really want the viewer to focus on the actual green bushes and trees and houses, or do you want me to focus on the clock tower and the clouds? How do these areas incorporate into what you're actually trying to say? So it's something to think about when you're actually framing a photograph. But as I say, the portrait crop works very well. It emphasises the height of the tower and the height of the clouds. As one of the things portraits crops are also very good at is emphasising height of an object. 14. Here, rhinos, I think very much a pattern picture. You've got the rhinos nicely lined up like that. Very well trained. You're viewing, and I think what works really well is as you view down, this final rhino, it's just broken up the pattern a little bit, so he's looking a little bit more towards you. And I think that's important in pattern photos, because it's the element which it doesn't actually match the pattern, which is what actually lifts the image and puts some energy in and actually makes it more engaging. It would have been less interesting if you'd had the 3 rhinos all perfectly matching each other. One of the challenges, however, with this is we talked about actually trying to create depth within the image. The rhinos themselves are fairly even in tone and brightness. They do tend to actually blend into each other. Within post, one way of actually trying to create that greater separation would have been slightly darken this one more and then slightly darken this one even further. So that creates more impression of 3 separate rhinos, because ultimately a photograph is just a collection of lines, colours and patterns. It's we then add the interpretation on this, so it's helping us to add the interpretation. I think the square crop works well. I've taken out any extraneous detail. 14. Xander's album. I think once again we come into the storytelling element here. I think you've done that very well. You don't always need the subject to look at you. Here, the angle is enough so that you're not side on. You're not totally side on. You're more slightly 45 degrees. But he's looking up into the air. You can imagine him either dreaming up his next album or playing and just imagining in his own little world whilst he's actually playing his album. It's got some attractive dappled light on his face, just creating that sort of more romantic, mystical image. And it feels like quite I don't know why, I'd imagine him doing a really romantic album for some reason. No idea why. One of the things to think about, however, we talked about distracting elements, and once again, you've got this fairly bright green here in the background, and that is drawing my eye to this section of the image as opposed to Xander himself. So can you look at toning that down a little bit so there's nothing competing for attention with him? I think the square crop works well. 17.
Gavin McBride.
Waterman side. Here you've got very attractive scene. There's lots of different interesting elements within the image. You've got, first of all, you've got this jetty with a bird arranged on every pillar, which I think is brilliant. Then you've got the boats, and then you've got the actual the light falling on the trees behind and the smoke coming off the actual trees. One of the things to think about is, what do you want me as a viewer to look at? What do you want me to actually focus on in particular? There's quite a lot here too, and the jetty creates a leading line to the boats, but it's actually quite large in the frame. The boats are quite small in the frame, so it's actually, could you have honed in any further onto the actual image itself? Could you refine your vision further? That's something to sort of think about. For me, the most attractive element is this light behind here. You've got some gorgeous light falling on the trees with wonderful rich tones and the smoke coming forward. So if I'd been there, I think about actually possibly honing in more on that. The jetty itself, unfortunately, the boats are slightly out of focus, especially because it's not enough out of focus to make it look intentional. One of these things you need to do, if you're is either have it sharp or have it properly out of focus, but it needs to make it look like an actual conscious decision. I think you've got a lovely sort of evening feel about it, and you've got some, as I say, you've got some absolutely gorgeous light across this area here, and I think the smoke works really well across with the mountains. 14. Oops, take the drawing off. Another really rural pastoral scene with the I assume it's evening light creating this warm glow across the actual scene itself. You've got some clear foreground, the trees form the middle ground, and then you've got the background of the actual flatter fields behind. One thing to think about once again is the crop. The area in the front, once again looking at how does a viewer view an image. The area in the front, as it's at the front of the image, is the first my eyes go to. It's quite textured, which draws my eye. It's slightly lighter than the sun's middle ground, which once again draws my eye. Would the image be stronger without it or with it? And it's something for you to make a conscious decision. But because you've included it, I look at it. Is actually, if you took that off, would the image itself be more interesting beyond that grass? So just something to consider. Also, one thing to be really conscious of is your placement of trees within an image. How does this impact the viewing experience? Once again, you need to think about the psychology of how you look at something. So these trees are relatively central. So I look through to them, and then I have to kind of peer around either side. But because they are quite dark, they're quite large in the frame relevant compared to some of the other elements, they're textured. They actually act as a very clear focal point. And one thing to think about is so sometimes when having a tree towards the centre, it can actually to a certain degree block the viewer's eye from going around and exploring beyond it, because the attention tends to go there. If you put them a little bit more at the side, and you took this bit off, then the trees would still be there, but it will make it easier for a viewer to actually explore the image around them. They're less in the centre blocking, they're more part of the scenery, part of the stage, and you can notice them and you can go on beyond. So it's just something to think about in terms of psychology of how you view things as a viewer point. I think you've got some great light. I love the shade and the light across here, and the evening feel. 16.
Elisa Sadat.
Here, some really interesting colours and textures from the scene itself. I don't know where this is. I'd be curious to know whether this was actually rock or something, algae or lichen on the rock, or what actually caused that. It works very well, strong contrast with the actual warmer, richer foliage of the trees around it. It creates a really interesting image. And you've got this lone tree here. And we were talking about, in the last image, trees being in the centre blocking. So here, the focus is the tree. You can look at it and appreciate, but then you actually go on and explore the rest of the image behind. One of the things I'd think about is, and it was again, personal decision. Everything you include in the image creates interest. Your eye goes to the odd one out. What's the odd one out? It's this background here. It's a different texture, it's different colours. So so that does, to a certain degree, draw your eye because it's different from the actual rest of the image itself. Now, from you as a photographer's point of view, do you want the viewer to actually focus on that and take that in, or do you want them to keep them in more this area? And that is a conscious decision opposed to where you crop. But I think there's some great colours and tones within it. 16.
Mandy Foreman.
Abandoned. And here we've got another wreck. I'm not sure whether it's the same wrecks as we saw earlier on. You've definitely got more impressive wrecks up there than we do down in Sussex. Leigh-on-Sea is where we get wrecks, which is along the estuary coastline to Southend. They tend to be small little boats. They're not very interesting compared to these big structures you've got here. There's a lot to look at, a lot to see in this image. It is very, very, very challenging to photograph this sort of things. Where do you focus? Where do you home in? What do you show? Also, where do you stand? Because you're not going to be standing on the deck, that's for sure. You can, but you're going down. Yeah, I don't advise it. And also, what's the landscape around? How do you get the position? Because here you look like you're photographing up towards the boat, or it's hard to work out exactly the angle, but it's quite a challenging angle, I think, to take. You've got some really interesting detail here. The old workings, the tree growing, which enhances the feeling of dereliction. What I would say is possibly, if you had less in the image, would it exaggerate the features more? So if you looked at cropping off part of this end, and as I say, the more you have in the image, we said, the more it dilutes the impact. If you focus in more on an area, and it's really challenging because there's so many interesting bits, but if you focus more in on an area and take out some extra areas, does that increase the impact of the area you're focused in on? So it's just something to think about. And once again, we also talked about colour, and I'd almost think about also subtly desaturating some of this area around here. And this is where selective edits, and if you subtly desaturate some of the area of the orange along this bit, what would that do? It brings your eye even more to the middle here. And I'm not talking about colour popping, I'm just talking about taking some of the colour out, because your eye goes to the most saturated point. So that, once again, it's all about controlling how the viewer actually looks at your image itself. But I think it's a really interesting rec, and I'm incredibly jealous of you guys that you've actually got that sort of thing up here. 15.
Steve Weatherly.
Here I think we've got a very clever piece of architectural photography. Very simple, but often the simple things are some of the really simple things are the hardest to do. You've got and we talked about visual intensity as well, and the different elements would actually take a very simple image and make it engaging. So texture adds energy to an image, colour adds energy to an image. So all of those, and contrast do as well, and all of those creates a greater visual intensity within what's a similar image. If you can imagine, if this wasn't the red, if this wasn't textured, you didn't have the light coming through, it wouldn't be half as interesting. I think what works also really well, is very clever, is the way that you have created an image of two halves and it's mirrored. You've got this implied diagonal coming up through there of these windows and from the frame itself. So windows like that. And that once again creates a more energetic feel. Diagonal lines create energy. And you've got the interesting bit, once again, you've got this, because it looks a little bit odd, you have to look at this and go, okay, that's a window there, well, what's that? Okay, that's the same window. So it starts engaging you as a viewer, because you've got to try and work it out as well. It's not something which gives everything to you on the plate. You need to think about it. So I think it's very well done, his architectural photography, and I'll hold that back. Oh, poor little boy. He looks very happy to be abandoned, mind you. Do you think he's abandoned? He's like, oh God, I got rid of my human. That child is really annoying. She kept dropping me in muddy puddles. Here I think it's quite interesting positioning in frame, in terms of you're starting to create a story, because he's left on the wall, but you've got this path growing off there. So you can imagine actually him being left on the wall and the humans then heading off to pastures new. And it's all to do with Gestalt psychology and implied lines and how you actually perceive things. Because having a path there and the diagonal, it creates a sense of journey. One of the things I think about is how can you accentuate the feeling of abandonment? What is abandonment? Well, he's actually quite large in the frame. If you had him smaller in the frame, so this is what you think about, the size of something in the frame. If something's smaller in the frame compared to the environment around, it creates a sense of invulnerability. If you can imagine a small child in this big stone room, that child feels vulnerable, it feels fragile. If you put a huge child and took the room out, the child feel much more confident and secure and assured. So something to think about when you're actually looking at the size of objects into the frame, because he's actually quite large in the frame here. He's actually quite confident. And does that fit with the whole abandon? So it's just thinking about that. It feels fairly desaturated there around the image and around him. And I think that works well because desaturation fits with a feeling of not so happy. And I think in terms of psychological, the way you control the viewer's perception, I think that works very, very well. 16.
And your Stott.
He's absolutely gorgeous. He's very, very cute. I think you've got great texture and detail in the coat. What we're probably now going to say is the seaweed around him is very bright and very textured. And your eye does go to brightness, your eye does go to texture. It competes with him as a star of the image. He 100% needs to be the star. The seaweed is just the scenery he's in. So what I'd suggest potentially is if you just darkened and desaturated that a touch, that would actually help take away would actually increase the impact of the actual otter itself. You still keep the seaweed, you still keep the feeling, you still get some of the yellowness, but you just take out some of his intensity and saturation so it doesn't compete with the otter as well. This is important. I think it's really good that you've got him in the actual environment, you've got him in his space he's actually found in. So I think that's really important. It's just creating that little bit of balance and visual hierarchy within the image. 17.
Brad Cheek.
I think interesting viewpoint. I like the fact that you've tried to do something a little bit different. So you're peering through the trees at the stream itself. So I'm having conscious of the time, so I'm having to speed up a bit. You've got this really interesting viewpoint. You've created a frame within the frame for the actual water and the creek itself. What I would think about is how could you further accentuate this? Well, you've got a bright area above here, so your eye tends to go up to the bright area. Can you just clone some more leaves across that? Or possibly crops a little bit lower, so you got rid of that entirely. That would have increased the impact of the stream. Also, this tree in the foreground is quite bright. Once again, talking about what's the star of the subject, where do you want the viewer to focus? Your eye goes to bright areas. Do you want my attention to focus on here, or do you want this just to be part of the actual frame and my attention to focus on there? So it's just something about how you balance the hierarchy of an image in terms of controlling the viewer's point. 15.
Jan Kent.
Here, it's a very interesting image. There's an awful lot in it. There's an awful lot of different stories. You've got the sky with the actual big wheel around there, but you've got this whole little story going on there as well, and the diversion sign. And the question is, what is the story? What do you want me to look at? As I said, where do you want me to focus? The diversion sign is really big and yellow at the bottom of the image. It leads me out. Is this the most critical bit of the photo? This is really where the eye goes to, and it says we're leaving. Is that what you actually want to say about the image itself, or do you want to focus on the actual big wheel itself, as the title suggests, where you could and if you just cropped it in a little bit more here, the attention would be drawn much more to the big wheel and the actual stunning star behind. So I think there's lots of interesting elements in this image, but I think you've got several stories there. And it's actually deciding if this bottom bit was a story, then I'd actually take out some of the top area, because that's actually competing for attention of the bottom area. So it's just making clear what's your vision, what you're trying to say, what you're trying to sell. 16.
Graham Harvey.
Oh, he's absolutely gorgeous. I think the lighting works really well on him. I love the way he's stretching up to the berries. For some reason, it slightly reminds me of mistletoe. And I know it's not mistletoe, but I do feel like he should be waiting for a kiss underneath it. Possibly he's just really cute. One of the challenges you face is his tail is stuck out behind, which means you've got a lot of negative space that side. Does it add anything to the image? In this particular, and I do like negative image space, but in this particular image, I don't think it necessarily adds anything to an image. I think he would have been stronger in a portrait crop, which would have actually emphasised him stretching up to the berries and focus your attention more on this upward line. Obviously, he's a selfish little mouse. His tail's in the wrong area. You just can't get the quality of mice to work with nowadays. It's shocking, but I think there's an awful lot to like about him. I think the lighting's great. There's nothing distracting on the actual wood here. It's desaturated, it's darkened. The attention very clearly is focused on him reaching up the berries. 18.
Mandy Foreman.
Leaving Venice as the sunset. Here, once again, we've got a lot in the image. You've got this gorgeous sunset with these gorgeous, and I can never pronounce the proper word for it, rays coming down, and some lovely light across that. But you've got a lot of sea here, and you've got the grass there. So I think about, once again, when looking at this, what do you want me to look at? What's the story? What really excited you about the scene? Was it this bit of grass, land, and the actual water coming up there? Was it the sky, or was it actually the actual skyline itself? And I think, once again, the more you've got in an image, the more it dilutes the impact of it. And I think you've got a really strong letterbox crop, extremely badly drawn by me there. So if you take out that bit, the bottom bit, you take out the top bit, obviously not exact crop, what you do is you focus the viewer's attention on the skyline of Venice and the sunset and the rays coming down on it and the beautiful light on it. And actually, suddenly you've got much more impact to the image itself. Because ask yourself, how much does this sea add to the story? How much does this grass add to the story? Is it that actually that interesting? Or is this the most interesting element? And I think this is a really, really attractive element you've seen. It's just bringing it out a little bit further by looking at how do you crop and how do you accentuate it. 16.
Colin Yates.
Here, I'm sure I saw this in black and white early on. I'm losing the plot. Here you've got dancer leaping into the light. One of the things to think about is when you're having a title like that, it indicates for me as a viewer that I should be looking at something. She is not really that close to the light. It doesn't feel like it's a huge forward motion. And she's looking very clearly at me. So it doesn't actually feel like she's leaping into the light. There's light there, but there's not a sense of actually that she's about to go and leap into it. You'd need more short psychology, things which are close together, you group together. She'd need to be closer to the light to actually build up that story, possibly even having the light just starting to come across her foot. So you got a feeling of her going into that. At the moment, she's quite separated from the light, exaggerated by her gaze. I think the positioning of her in the actual arch works really well because that frames her very well, and it's the textures and the contrast between the elegance and delicacy of a ballet dancer and the hard texture of the brick creates an interesting contrast. 16.
Ruth Lockery.
Morning light, you've got some attractive light beams coming onto the flowers themselves. I think it works well that the rest of the image is quite dark and subdued because it really helps create that feeling of morning and things starting to wake up. The one thing I'd say that look about, little detail, minor thing, just look at the edges because you've got the start of a bud coming through. It acts as a little bit of distraction, just reducing the impact slightly of the photo itself. But I think the portrait crop works well. 18.
Alison Townley.
Here's a very tropical scene. There's something about palm trees and sun coming through, which gives me an idea of Hawaii, Bahamas or such like. I think the starburst itself works well. It accentuates that feeling of tropical holiday destination, as does the colours and tones. I would say is, do we need as much of this area to the left as we have in terms of negative space? I feel possibly the story is here, some negative space frames it, but then it gets to a point of, does it actually add any interest? Does it take away from the actual subject matter itself? I like the silhouettes and the spikiness of the pine trees. 17.
Kevin McBride.
I think these are very well done. You've got great detail on the heads and on the hairs. The focus is on the eyes and the face, where you actually want it to be. And I'm really enjoying the reflection in the water. I'm not quite sure the logic of how this works and how it's done, because we seem to have a deliberate line between the texture of the water and actually the reflection underneath. It asks questions about how that happens, but it doesn't actually detract from the image. The use of the black negative space either side frames them well, focus the attention in the middle. Here they are centrally placed, but they're bright, they're dynamic, they are very, they add energy to the image, so the central placement works well for them. I'm holding that one back. Absolutely gorgeous girl, could just benefit from being that little bit higher in the frame, 19.
Kirsty Railton.
Very clever image, very conceptual, very well thought out. It's not just a pretty photograph, it's of something about something and actually makes a statement about the world today, 20.
Reg Haslam.
Beautifully produced moth. All parts of the image work extremely well together, 20.
Mike Atkinson.
Really interesting image. I think the colours work well. It's very well thought out, 19.
Dan Johnson.
He's absolutely gorgeous. I want to take him home and cuddle. If he'd had that little bit of space cropped off on that side, it'd be a 20, just for the balance of the image, but a 19.
Christine Armstrong.
Very well done architectural shot, 19.
Colin Rogers.
Yeah, they're absolutely brilliant. I think it's exceedingly well done, 20.
Ruth Lockery.
Hi, so first image, newborn grey seal. I think he's incredibly cute. You've got a wonderful sense of texture and softness to his fur. And I absolutely love the expression on his face. He just looks absolutely adorable. What I would say is he's cropped very, very tightly into the frame. It almost feels like he feels cramped. It's one way of people saying it almost feels like he's getting a bit of a headache because he's got no room to move. It's even tighter there. So I think he'd benefit from that little bit more space, not a huge amount, because you don't want the surrounding areas to compete with him, but just that little bit more space in the frame to actually help him, expression is to use, to breathe within it. But I think it's quite challenging to actually get the actual texture and softness of the fur to feel as realistic as it does. You can feel you could almost touch him. 18.
Mike Atkinson.
I think it's a really interesting choice showing the bee in mono. It's not something you typically see. But it would work quite well, because I don't know the plant behind him, but if the plant was competing in colour with him, then that would be very, very effective. You've chosen a shallow depth of field, which, I mean, you've got good detail in the head, but you've lost his wing there. The important thing is having the head sharp, and we don't need to necessarily have the wing totally sharp. You just need a little bit more of a sense of the wing being there, because he actually looks a little bit one-winged at the moment. I think that it's an interesting choice of portrait crop, gives a feeling of height and that he's about to go and climb up the plant itself. 17.
Kirsty Railton.
Here we've got a very interesting image. It's more sort of the documentary type than necessarily the fine art. You can imagine this as part of a project, talking about an area, talking about a place. We're quite sideways on him, so even though he's looking at us, we've got a feeling of the observer being slightly separate, which also tends to lead itself a little bit more to the documentary. What I would say is, how can you actually increase the impact of him? The overall tone of the image feels quite grey and quite even. How can you actually get him to pop out more from the photo itself? And what I would suggest is, if you just subtly darken the houses around him and subtly lighten the actual cart and the guy himself and the lighter parts of the horse, you created greater separation. So you've made him pop out and stand out more from the image itself. 16.
Graham Harvey.
It's a very interesting image. It's an image of contrast. So you've got the really gritty, concrete urban structure contrasting with the nature and the wildlife beyond. It's another image which is quite challenging to take because you're taking it from very dark to very light. So you've got a very high dynamic image, dynamic range. So you've got this very bright, sort of burnt out area from there because that's so light. Your camera's struggled to actually cope. So it's one of the things, another of those images which would have benefited from having several exposures and being blended so that you can actually control the environment outside and then you control the environment inside to create a more even image. I think the composition works very, very well. You've got the strong diagonal at a quite dynamic angle here, framing the rest of the image. So you created a frame within a frame. You've got all the texture of the stone, of the steps coming up. Once again, you've got the diagonal, which adds image, and then you've got this interesting structure beyond here. So compositionally, I think it works really, really well. I think you just struggled a bit with the actual lighting conditions because it's very challenging to do in the circumstances. So this sort of thing, you just have to kind of cheat and take 2 images. 16.
Lucy Wilson.
Really interesting image, sort of it feels very conceptual. You can feel a real sense of story there. There's a lady called Martina Lindqvist. She's done a scene called 1,000 Little Suns, sort of a project, and it's all about sort of dark and light, similar to a certain degree to this. I like when you have dark, within dark things lurk, things loom. When there's something lit within that, it could either be from a hope or something, or there's something going on. There's a real feeling that something's going to actually go on and happen in some way or other, whether it's from the dark or whether from the light. Once again, I think you could possibly be that little bit bolder with this because you've got the light areas coming around there, and you've actually got quite a lot of light around the hut itself. Now, I don't know how much this is in your control, how much it was in the environmental lighting, or how much you brought lighting there. But you could even do something a little bit in the light room with gradients and just almost take out just this area here, just darken it that little bit more, and especially that little bit. So you isolate that hut that little bit more and you build on that feeling of suspense, darkness, and the actual overall tension story of the image. I think it's a really nice concept. It's really interesting. It's different. 18.
Brad Cheek.
This very interesting composition. I think some really good ideas about how you control the viewer's eyes and creating a clear visual hierarchy, because you have I'm assuming this is the same image flipped. I may be wrong. It's really bad at assuming anything as a judge. But what do you have is your eye, first of all, goes directly up to this hut here. This hut, we talked about start, we talked about sporting cast. This house here, it's because you have the line here, it blocks you off from going down that route. You very clearly follow the leading line to that. You're aware of that, it's part of the story, but you've got a clear line of direction, clear focal point. I think it's probably quite challenging what you've done, and I think you face some cloning problems because you've got this whole area in the middle. You can more or less get away with this bit, but that area in the middle looks quite muddy. It's very different from the rest. There's a lot of texture. It's a lot darker. It does really distract the attention because it looks like the odd one out within the image, and it is challenging to kind of clone this sort of thing. So I think you've got a really good idea, really good concept, very good control of how the viewer actually looks and views at the image itself. It just needs some tidying up in this area. 17.
Mandy Foreman.
Here you've given us a very atmospheric image. I love fog. Fog and snow are my 2 favourite conditions. Snow we definitely don't get enough of down south. Beast from the East. When we hit the south, I got insanely excited. Got in my car quickly. I didn't want London snow. I wanted countryside snow. So I drove down the A10. I wasn't sure how many lanes it had. There was idiots driving in the first 2 lanes, 20 miles an hour tailgating. It's like, the reason you're doing 20 is because it's slippery. Don't sit in the tail of the car in front then. So I kind of decided there's room for a 3rd lane there. I'm just going with the 3rd lane. I think I found out afterwards there wasn't actually a 3rd lane there, but there you go. You make it up as you go along. So here, it's very simple, very peaceful, very tranquil image, but it works very, very effectively. You have a strong leading line taking you through the actual image itself. You do have this path here, but it's darker, it's shaded, this path is brighter. So therefore you're aware of this section of it, but you actually, but your eyes clearly guide it through that. These 2 trees provide balance with each other. And you've got a great sense of depth through the fog, creating separation between the tree in the front and the trees in the background. And the leading line coming up there. It's good contrast within the image itself as well, very well processed. I'm holding it back. Here, once again, it's a very interesting image, quite spooky in feel. I think we've got 2 stories here, however. So you've got this really sort of slightly out of focus, blurry element here, but then you've got this very sharp signpost here and the sharp tree here. Now, your eye goes to the sharpest point of the image. So my eye very clearly goes to you're aware of this other section, but my eye very clearly goes to there, and the signpost leads you out of the image. So that could be, if you looked at cropping with something like there, that could be a way out of the spooky forest. For me, what I actually like is a slightly Blair Witch Project feel of it. Because if you just took that element out, you take the sharpness out, and suddenly you're left with these 3 spooky trees, slightly out of focus, slightly edgy, and there's mist. And when you cut, in some ways, when you've got a fog like this, it can also, and you've created that whole feel with the very dark trees without any details, things hide in the mist. So you've actually created that whole almost cinematographic type feel of going through this spooky forest into something which you can't see. So I think there's 2 different stories to it, some really interesting ideas. I think it's really creative. 17.
Jan Kent.
I saw this when we looked through it. I thought I really like this image. I think the processing black and white works really, really well. You've got really strong blacks, great tone, great contrast. But I also really like the use of the flowers placed on the actual camera itself. Now, there's 2 people in a photograph, the photographer and the viewer. And if the title doesn't necessarily give the viewer any clues, the viewer then starts creating perceptions about the image based on their own experience and their own life studies. And to me, the flowers almost resemble a garland on the camera itself. It's like the relationship some people have with their gear, where it's almost like you have, there's different paths in photography. Some people absolutely love the gear, and that's a massive part of them. Some people are less interested. Here, I feel like you've got this vintage classic camera, and you've got all the flower blossoms on them, and it's almost like worshipping the actual camera itself. You could have actually intended to mean something entirely different from that. And I say this is where there's always 2 people within the image itself. I think what's also worked well in terms of the image is you've placed it on, there's a slight hint of diagonal floorboards going across there, which creates that sense of, once again, a slight bit of dynamic tension to the image itself. I'm holding it back. Here we've got very interesting abstract image. There is a lot of textures, a lot of patterns, a lot of contrast, all of which actually draw the eye and create energy in the photo itself. I think this is another one which may not necessarily always work best in this sort of format of competition. So once again, it's another one I could actually imagine either really, really small, so you have to go and peer in and study to it, or really large and dominant. It's not an image of an in-between. I think It's very dynamic. Once again, you've got the diagonal lines coming across, which creates energy. The contrast creates energy. It's a really dynamic image. I think it's a great abstract. I just don't think it necessarily works in this particular format, and that is one of the challenges for competitions. 17.
Alan Phillips.
Cragside. Now, here once again, you've got an interesting image. You've got lots of interesting elements in it. You have the stream coming through as a strong leading line. Because of the strong contrast between the actual foam and the black, it draws your eye. Contrast draws your eye. This is the most contrasty part in the image. But you've also got this actual castle at the top, or this house or building. And I'm not sure whether Cragside is the park or the environment or the house itself. And I think one of these things is, what do you want me to look at? What do you want me to focus on? Is the stream and the environment the most important part? Or is the house the most important part? If the stream is the most important part, it works well because the attention is drawn to this and my focus is drawn to this. You could almost lose some of the top of the image so that emphasizes the actual stream in the image. If the house is the most important part and the stream is a leading line up to the house, so I'll go into a 5-dot scrolling, then I'd actually think about darkening the stream and actually possibly even going on a little bit further and taking some of it off, just because at the moment it competes for attention. It's quite dynamic. So with all the contrast and the actual size in the frame. So thinking about where you want the viewer to look and how do you control the way the viewer actually looks within the image itself. What's the subject, and take away any distracting elements from it. 16.
Graham Harvey.
Here, I think it's a very well processed image. There's some gorgeous tones going across it. The negative space works really well because it creates a sense of the smallness of the Spitfire in the sky itself. One of the things I think about, however, is the positioning in the frame and the angle of the Spitfire. It's reasonably central in the frame, so it doesn't necessarily have so much sense of having travelled from somewhere or to somewhere. It's also pointing downwards, which kind of, because it has less of a forward travel sense, and the angle, it does give a slight feeling of the poor little thing's about to go and crash at some point. So it's just thinking about what angle do you have the plane in, and how does the actual cropping of it accentuate forward travel or downward travel to a certain degree. I think there's some great light across it. Once again, you've got good detail in the propeller, some attractive highlights across these areas. And I think the sky works really well. It's just enough to create atmosphere, but not enough to actually compete with the Spitfire for attention. I'll hold it back. Here's once again, it's a really interesting conceptual image. It makes you think, it makes you try and work out what the photographer's actually saying. So you've got the cat walking along the actual boardwalk, but everything's out of focus, everything's slightly surreal around it. Is this how the world appears to the cat? Is it passing through this swirling mass, and this is like a different cat's viewpoint? So I think it's an interesting idea. Once again, this is kind of how my interpretation of it is. You may have meant something different from it, but certainly for me, it feels like this is what the world of a cat feels like as it passes through it, heading home. I'll hold that one back. Here we have an abstract image, very well, obviously, very well composed. You've got all the elements work exceedingly well together to give just the right amount of visual intensity. So you've got the contrast between the really bright white and the dark. The frame around the image itself, the white around the image itself, complements the frame here and complements the circle here. You've got interesting shapes, you've got interesting lines, you've got really good light across it. So I think it's exceedingly well done, and I'm holding that one back. Here we've got another scene of nighttime light on the tree itself, on a tree. It's, once again, slightly spooky feel, slightly mysterious. Could you have built on this a bit further? Could you have darkened the sky down a little bit more of a gradient, and just to actually build on the spookiness of itself? I think the reflection works well. Being in the centre of the frame works reasonably well with this, because it is, by the fact there's a lot of contrast within the tree, it does create a dynamic energy which compensates for a fairly central place. You could also, however, have put it more in this area, and that would have created an entirely different feel, and you've got some more dynamic tension as a result of placing it close to the edge of the frame. It's one of these things, people talk about rule of thirds, and I always want to know, well, why put it, what actually impact does it have to put it close to the third? The closer to the edge of an image you have something, the greater dynamic tension you build into an image. So the rule of thirds is part of the way there, but if you put it even closer to an edge in an item, you'll build even more dynamic tension to it. So it gives something to consciously think about. 17.
Kevin Gilpin.
Here you've got rather attractive seals. I like the variations in poses. If you look at portrait photography, things like Adi Leibovitz, the characters she has, she puts them in different positions, different heights to create interest. Here it's a similar effect with the seal, one full on, facing you, one side on, one looking out of the image. The processing itself is very heavy on the mid-tone. So overall, nothing really stands out or pops out. So one of the things within black and white is very, very dependent on tone and differences in tone. So I think of darkening areas, possibly darkening the water, lightening the seal, and just creating that greater distinction with sort of dodging and burning between the various elements to make the seals a very clear star of the image. 15.
John Kent.
Here, it's very obviously a really attractive scene. It's very clear you got there. There's lots of amazing elements to the image itself. And once again, it's looking at, do we need everything in the image? How do we, the more we have in an image, the more it dilutes impact. Would there be, so where is it you would actually really, what would make you take the photos? Was this these trees in the foreground? Was it the mountains in the background? Was it the cloud across the top of the mountains? So it's actually really thinking about in the scene what it was which particularly inspired you and motivated you. For instance, you could have a little scene here, very badly cropped, where you've got this little bit of lake, a leading line through to the mountains, and you've got this gorgeous cloud across the mountains themselves, these instinct structures. If you wanted the trees to be more of an area of focus, potentially you're a little bit challenged here because the trees are merging into the mountains behind. A better day with more fog or more considerate low crowd would work better. But it's just thinking, once again, more clarity of the vision. It's an amazing scene. What in particular did you respond to? What really do you want to show me as a viewer? 16.
Mike Atkinson.
Here it's a very, I think it's very well processed, black and white, good strong tones. I think the choice of, she stands out well from the background. It's very clear, we talked about things popping out. She very clearly pops out from the actual wall herself. For instance, her hat's quite light, the wall is a lot darker, so there's very clear separation there. I'm not sure if she was part of a reenactment or whether she was naturally there, but there's an element of, she doesn't feel entirely natural. There's an element of, she feels like she's almost posed or staged there. And once again, it's like waiting for that slightly more natural moment where it feels slightly more authentic. But I think you've got good detail in the actual coat itself. Positioning of the frame works well. I'm holding it back. Here presents us a very sad scene. I think you've got great light here. It's created real modelling of the actual gravestones themselves, giving real depth. You've got the dark of the shadow and the light, which takes a 2D scene and makes it 3D. You've got quite a lot here within the image, especially just elements such as these bushes breaking it up. You don't necessarily need to show everything to give the feel of the actual scene itself you're conveying. Because this is under short psychology, there's a feeling of continuation. So if a line goes across somewhere from start to the edge of an image, the viewer itself will assume that that line continues to go. So you may not show the whole width of something, but the viewer perceives it to be greater than what you've actually shown. So I'm almost wondering whether, and we say the less you have an image, the more impact it has, really badly cropped. So I'm almost wondering whether you could actually have a smaller image within here. We've got the diagonals coming through, you've got all the stones, you've taken out some of the distracting elements of a lot of those bushes. But I still perceive a feeling of immensity because the graves go out that side of the photo and they go out that side of the photo, so you've got a feeling of scale. It's just something to think about because it's quite challenging. The gardeners just don't help you here. But I mean, it's a very sombre scene. I think the lighting you captured it in has absolutely worked really, really well to give that whole sense of depth within the image itself. 16.
Gavin McBride.
I like the fact here that you presented the image with a lot of negative space. I think it works very well, gives a sense of immensity. The ship looks very small in the scene, gives a sense of a big, expansive ocean. One of the things to think about is balance of an image. When you look at balancing an image, imagine having a fulcrum in the middle and it's like a bit of a seesaw. Here you've got a lot of dark to the left, which actually makes it feel a little bit as if the image is heavier on this side to that side, and it's almost like it'll tip over to the left a little bit. And this is one of the things to think about when you look at the positioning of the elements in the frame. Obviously, you can't control where the ship is. He may have just stayed over that side, but often it works. If you've got a dark area that side, then to have the dark area that side, so it creates greater balance of the tones. I think there's an attractive sky. It's very clear where the focus is in terms of there's more sea and boat than there is sky, so it's very clear where you want me to look. Once again, I think it just face a challenging lighting conditions due to the brightness of the sky and the darkness of the actual structures itself. 14. Here, given us a really interesting image. I think the dark tones, work really well in terms of creating a mood. It feels quite sombre. We talked about the boats earlier on in the colour, it's all bright and cheerful. Here, I think the tones work very well with the feeling of dereliction. I may be wrong, it may not be derelict, it kind of looks it. And Twisted Metal leads me to think it is. It's one of these forgotten roller coasters you see in books and magazines. We talked about distracting elements, things which can take your focus away, things which are different from the rest. Here, I don't know whether there's a tree or something growing, but because A, it's brighter, B, it's reasonably large in the frame, and B and C, it's quite hard to work out. My attention tends to go there and try and work out what it is. And this is necessarily the most interesting part of the image. And once again, I think you could almost get rid of that section, the confusing section, and you've got some really interesting, nice shapes here of the roller coaster itself. You still got the dark tones you've used. You still got that whole feeling of sort of dereliction and forgottenness, but you've just taken out the distracting elements of the really inconsiderate possible tree. So I think it's well seen, really interesting. I think the toning works really well, the subject matter. It's just refining it a little bit more and taking out distracting elements. 15.
Daniel Stott.
Yeah, dew's absolutely gorgeous in plants. It's something you always try and capture. And I really enjoy that little detail of the spider's web you've got there as well, just lifting the image a bit. I think it's good that you've chosen to knock the background out of focus. However, you could possibly have gone even further because there's still quite a strong element of contrast between the black and you've got some really bright highlights. So that's still, and because it almost is like there's a little area of out of focus, just out of focus enough to make me as a viewer try and work out what it is, but not out of focus enough to make it not distracting. And we're just that little bit on the edge here. It's out of focus. Well, what is that? And it attracts my attention. Just that little bit greater depth of field would have actually blurred it that little bit more and made it just of a background environment as opposed to something demanding attention itself. But I think it's an interesting composition. I think the use of the portrait crop works well to emphasise the height of the actual leaves itself. 14. Here, Tidorf and Timonati. Another thing that's great, I actually had to go and look this up on the internet again to find out where they were. I've now forgotten, I think it was Indonesia or somewhere. I think it's an interesting viewpoint. You're looking from something to through something. You've got this really interesting textured rock in the foreground, with really good light bringing out the texture, the crevices, the spray bouncing off it, and then this volcano in the background. It's clear visual hierarchy, okay, or island in the background, a clear visual hierarchy, as in this area is slightly out of focus, this area is in focus. So my attention goes there and goes back to there, but this is the clear focal point. However, what you do have is you have all this empty space to the right here, and it almost acts as a leading line, taking you out of the photo. Your attention goes to the rock. Okay, there's space around the rock. I'm now going to move into that space. So your focus almost wanders off to this side. Is that where you want it? Is this where you want my focus to go? Is there a way of actually controlling me as a viewer more? And what I think about doing is actually, if you got rid of some of that element here, you then, or even more there, you then control my viewpoint much more, so that I get to take in the rock and all the wonderful spray. Okay, it's still slightly tight there. And then I actually, because you forced me down this pathway, you forced me to the actual mountain there. I haven't gone and escaped off to this side. It's a very clear line through. And then you've got this interesting concept of this really rocky, stormy shore leading to the, which you'd have to go past to get to the island behind. So it creates a whole different, stronger story. I think the toning works well. And so the contrast between the spray and the water works really well. So there's a lot to like. I just think it needs a little bit more, just to control the viewer a little bit more in terms of where you want them to look and where you want the gaze to travel. 15.
Dan Johnson.
Here, I think what's done really good, once again, you've got a clear vision. You've chosen to show me a segment of the building, not the whole building as whole building itself. You've got a clear vision. So this is what you found interesting. This is what you want me to look at. So I think that works very well. The portrait crop emphasizes the height of the building. The one thing, unfortunately, you're challenged with is in terms of focus. The eye goes to your eye will go and look for the sharpest point. It's also what you expect a building to be. You expect a building to actually have hard angles, to be sharp, to be concrete. Concrete's hard. Having that slightly soft focus on this particular thing doesn't really quite work. But I think there's a lot to like about it in terms of actually the fact is you have had a clear vision. And I say the technical details like focus, that can come. It's the vision, it's the hard bit to have, and actually having a point of view saying, actually, this is what I find impressive, this is what I find interesting, this is what I want to show you as a viewer. 14. Really, it's another place I went and looked up on the internet. I was having a whole journey around the whole area. Some really interesting lines here you've got. I think it's a very interesting angle with the curves coming through and the light and the shade of the steps themselves. You've made an abstract image out of the stairwell, and there's lots of texture, there's lots of detail, there's lots of things for me to explore. One of the things to think about, however, is how straight is the actual wall itself. Here we've got a little bit of a right lean. If this was a building, it would be in real life, it would be a little bit of danger falling over. It is one of these challenges taking the images. There's an easy fix in Lightroom. It's called Lightroom Guidelines. And that really, really helps. So you just draw the guideline there, you draw the guideline there, you draw the guideline there. It straightens up your building. It's a lifesaver. It's wonderful. But I do like the detail you've shown me of the staircase. I love the texture. I think the fact that you've darkened this area works very well because it takes that distracting elements. My eye focuses very much along the pathway of the stairs and enjoys all the details here. 16.
Alison Townley.
Yeah, Church in the Sea. This is my wish list to go to. It's a really attractive scene. I think the fact that you've got the actual church itself small in the frame is very effective. So bear with me 1 second. I have to stop reminders. It's very effective. So once again, it creates a feeling of smallness and fragility against nature itself. I take off the red lines because, and we talked about the size of something in the image before. It's well balanced because you've got the dark there balancing the church there, and the actual choice of shutter speed creates a feeling of turbulent water around. I would say it is, and I looked it up, the horizon is very slightly tipping. So it's just very slightly tipping down to the left. It's accentuated further by this dark area, but there's just a little bit of a lean, and the water's a little bit flowing to the left. So just once again, it's fairly easy just to straighten up that fraction within Lightroom and Photoshop itself. But I think overall it's very well done. You've got a great sense of mood. You've got a strong storytelling element there. 18.
Mandy Foreman.
Here I think the choice of black and white is very effective for the subject matter, because when you take out colour, all you've got to focus on is texture, tone, structure and line. And here it really accentuates the sharp, spiky nature of the actual flower and the bud itself. So I think that it really emphasises the structure of it as opposed to the colours of the flower itself. So it's not an abstract, but you're almost going towards an abstract type feel. The darkening of the actual leaves around here works very well because the attention is focused at this top level of the image itself. It's created clear separation. I think overall it's well done. 16.
Dan Johnson.
Okay, here we've got a very conceptual image. So the titles are key, which is really important because it starts placing the objects you've shown in a context, a space and a time. So here, what you've given us is what to you represents the old key, what represents to you the history. And that is actually the anvil, the old bucket and the rope. There's a slightly soft focus feel to the image itself, which creates that whole sense of nostalgia. I think you've got good tone. The anvil stands out really well against the background of the lighter areas. Possibly some of the other elements just that little bit bright, which makes you a little bit step back as a viewer. But I think it's a good idea, good concept. 16.
Carolyn Phillips.
Get rid of the red. Once again, it's a very contemporary image. The elements of it work extremely well together. You've got, and it's a real story there, asks a lot of questions. You have this house, abandoned house, in this empty open landscape, and these two small figures, which are very much dwarfed by the environment behind. Your eye goes, we talk about visual weight, the house might be larger, but your eye goes to people. So even though they're small in the frame, they carry a large amount of visual weight because that's where your eye goes. So they balance the house nicely. It also asks an awful lot of questions. What are they doing? What's the connection to the house? What's the story? There's a whole load going on there. And I mean, if you've seen, there's Christopher, I've forgotten his surname. Hamilton's gallery in London. He's done something called Bittersweet's exhibition. And it'll be this big, vast, open expanse of landscape and just this tricycle left there. Or there's another one is a merry-go-round. And once again, it asks an awful lot of questions of the viewer. And one of the things you want the viewer to do when they look at your image is to start thinking about it. Because they think about it, they stay there. So And whilst most of the actual image itself is fairly light and mid-tone, you've got strong blacks there, you've got strong backs of the window creating contrast, which creates energy in the image itself. So I'm holding that back. Here, yeah, dead flowers are always appealing to. My mother buys sunflowers and tulips just to pretty much watch them die. My mother's a photographer, I should say, as opposed to just a bit mental. Here, once again, you've taken this flower, it's slowly decaying. One of the challenges you have is within black and white, you've only got tone to create structure. Here, within these flowers, you've got a huge range of tones of similar, or tones and brightness of similar brightness. This does make it difficult in terms of actually it all sort of, the different petals all blend into one. And one of these things looking at dodge and burn, how can you actually create greater separation? I'd say darken elements of this, which then gives, once again, we're talking about a 2D image, we want the viewer to start viewing it and perceiving it as a 3D image. Therefore, we need to artificially put that degree of separation in. So just darken different elements of that, and that will then make them stand out from the surrounding leaves. Coming in the diagonal works well, however, to give energy. That's 15.
Alan Phillips.
Here's a very interesting structural image. You've got great regularity of the fields and the patterns. It's very clear the viewpoint you've had and what you're trying to show me. These barns create interesting depth in the image and an interesting structure within itself. And certainly from down south, it's not something necessarily we see in terms of actually our agricultural environment. So that actually, from the point of view of saying you're a photographer, you've got a vision, you want to show someone something, it actually just shows how effective it is, because you're showing me parts of a different landscape, parts of a different world, which I wouldn't necessarily see. I like the detail of the little sheep and farmer in the corner as well. The processing itself, it's very heavy on the mid-tones, which makes it feel very flat. So I think it would benefit a lot from, benefit from a lot more contrast with the actual image itself. But I like the structure, I like the regularity. I like the fact that you've got just enough of the trees to create a frame, but it's very clear the star of the image is this section here. That is just supporting cast. 15.
Ruth Lockery.
Yeah, this is really interesting. Knight removes pawn. Normally, knight removes pawn with a chess move. I'm not sure what this structure is, but it almost looks like a broom. It more looks like a bit like an abusive relationship from the knight and the pawn, and the knight has actually beaten the pawn up and knocked it out of the photo. I'm not sure what the intention was. It's quite interesting, however, it's a different concept. I think it's quite challenging photographing glass. And here what we have is a lot of very bright highlights. So this is fairly distracting, or these are fairly distracting. You've got some very bright highlights here as well. It makes it a very busy image. I think it would benefit from dropping down in Lightroom, something, dropping the highlights down, using a softer light when you actually take it. So you've still got the actual sculpting effect of the light, but it's not as contrasty as it is in this image. I think it's an interesting idea, and I'm not quite sure about the abuse of the light to the pawn, but we're moving on from that. 16.
Carol Weatherly.
Here, lots of really interesting image elements of this image. It's a photograph of layers. So you've got the interesting limestone possibly there, or the rock. Then you've got the wall, the trees, then through the mist to the mountain behind. So you've created real depth here. It's one thing we talked about, however, the less you have in an image, the more impact it has. And also, one of the things I find often works very well with layers, and something for you to think about and consider, is if you have a more portrait crop, it really emphasises the layers more. So if you look at actually taking, this is just a random portrait crop. Oop, where's it gone? A random portrait crop. And it's just to sort of talk about the point, give you something to think about. And I've just lost annotate. It's all gone a bit mad. Bear with me 1 second. There. Okay, this is very much a random crop. But if you think about how it then structures the image, you've got the limestone there, then you've got that, then you've got that, and it really emphasises the layers further and builds up that sense of depth. And it also creates that additional dynamism to the image itself. So it's just something to think about in terms of how the actual use of landscape or portrait landscape or portrait format impacts how you view it and emphasises different elements of the image itself. 16.
Graph.
I think this was really interesting when I looked at it, and some really interesting storytelling. Obviously, you've got the knight's helmet there and various bits there, and you've got the bed beyond. But the knight's not there. It says the knight's rest, but where's the knight gone? Why has he left his gear? What's going on? So it actually asks questions and tells a story. What I would think about, we talked about how depth of field controls how you view an image. Sharpest element is that. The bed itself is actually it's not very sharp at all. And because of that, and this is what's the story you want to tell? How do you want me as a viewer to look at it? Because it's not very sharp, and that's very sharp, my attention stays there. But do you actually want me to actually look at the bed? Is that a key part of your story? If it's a key part of the story, that'll benefit from having greater depth of field and sharpness, because my eye would then move more and stay more to that element as opposed to just staying at the front of the image. But I think the square crop works really well. I think you've got an interesting story there and an interesting idea. 16.
Colin Yates.
Graffiti tree. It's very simplest, minimalist image. I think the portrait crop works well. For the title, graffiti tree, this is sometimes where you need to be careful of the actual title, because the title indicates I need to be looking for graffiti, but the actual tree itself doesn't have a huge amount of graffiti. So just think about how your title influences what the viewer is actually going to look for. You've got good contrast between the tree and the wall. It's very much an image of textures. So the light of the tree makes it stand out well against the wall, and you've got the textures of the brick against the actual fairly gnarled trunk of the tree. The slightly diagonal angle there, a little bit of irregularity adds interest, adds a bit of dynamic tension, as does the fact it's just slightly closer to that edge than it is to that edge. 17.
Elisa Sadat.
Good use of slow shutter speed, creates that feeling of water flowing, of water movement, wonderful milky feel. One thing to look at, once again, we talked about the elements in the image, everything the viewer looks at, everything which is in the viewer image, the viewer thinks is important and will actually think you intended to include there. Also, when things are in the middle, the fact they end up almost a bit of a full stop, you look and they tend to block a little bit of your view beyond them. And what I would say is this rock important to you as an image? Is this rock something you want me to look at? Or do you want my focus to be on the falls behind? And this is a decision of whether you want to include that rock or not. And if you think the rock's important and you want me to look past the rock to the falls, you could possibly consider having the rock more to the side of the image, which means it's there, I've noticed it, but then I move on round to the falls itself. So there's just some things to think about when you crop the actual image itself, how you present it, what do you actually want me to look at and view. 16.
Ruth Lockery.
I think compositionally this works well. The light falling on the boats makes them stand out from the dark sea and the dark sea. So I think you've got a good strong leading line. All the boats are actually, we talked about with the planes having a direction of travel. All the boats are pointed this direction. You also have the gap to the harbour that direction. So what you've created is an implied line of travel. And this comes under the short psychology. We will fill in the gaps of what may not be there, but we fill in the gaps ourselves. So you've created this implied line of travel of the boats leading out of the harbour itself. So you've created a story there. I think you lost a little bit of detail in these areas. It's possibly that little bit overly dark, could be lightened just that tad. But the sky above it, looming above, is an interesting sky with kind of really threatening clouds, which is probably why they're in the harbour themselves. 17.
Steve Weatherly.
I think it's a really good portrait of the bull. The fact that his face is so much lighter than the rest of the area means it really pops out. He stands out from the background. What I would say is, once again, where do you want me to look? What do you want my focus in? How can you actually emphasise the key elements? I'm assuming the key element is his head. Here, do we need as much negative space here? Does it add to the story? For me personally, no. I'd almost think about taking... I can really not draw straight lines. So if you actually take out some of the edges, what does it do? It just focuses you more in on the head. Because ultimately, what's the most interesting bit? This head, it's got great texture in the fur, brilliant expression. Even his mouth's rather appealing. He's now wearing lipstick. But apart from that, okay, got a cross-dresser ball now. But so I was just thinking about how can you actually, what's the subject? Is there anything there which is diluting the impact of the subject? Does the space add to it or take away from it? 18.
Colin Yates.
Here, it's a very attractive portrait. You've caught a real moment of tenderness as she's looking down at her stomach. It may be posed, but it feels natural. Her expression feels natural. And this is one of the things that we were talking about earlier on, which needs to capture. You are a little bit looking on, once again, from looking sideways on at her. So having her turned a little bit more towards you would once again shift the perspective from a bystander to a participant in the image. Also, because you've got her against the window, you face really challenging lighting conditions, because the lighting from the window is really bright and you want trying to get her face in focus as well, her face not too dark. So one of the things this sort of helps is actually using something like a reflector. Just you turn it slightly underexposed in your camera for the or exposed for the window, and then use the reflector to bounce the light back onto her face, which then deals with the challenging lighting conditions itself. But I think there's a lot to really like. The choice of clothing works really well, because the darkness really makes her stand out from the background as well. And I think she's got I really enjoying that tender expression on her face. 16.
Tina Cordukes.
This very much, to me, feels like 134 angles, feels very much like a pet ventosa. It creates a wonderful feeling of depth, etherealness. Are there things, do we need everything in the image? What do you want me to look at? What I would think about is you have the path here. So one tree, 4 angles, but you've also got one path for several angles as well. And the path is quite bright. It's a little bit abstract, a little bit out of focus, which then makes me as a viewer pay attention to it and try and work it out in my head itself. And that then distracts attention from the actual tree. So I think about, is this a key part of the story? Do you want to keep that in? And if so, you can potentially darken it, which will reduce some of the impact. Otherwise, could you look at actually having a tighter crop so you focus attention more on the tree in the top part of the image itself? You've got this wonderful artistic, delicate feel of the hedge. And it's a really interesting feel of the tree. 17.
Brad Cheek.
Looming tower, very good lighting on this. Strong directional lighting creates a real feeling of 3D with a light, create real modelling, light and shade. The portrait crop works really well to emphasise the feeling of height. 17.
Anissa Sadat.
I think this is a very interesting image. It feels very personal. You put yourself into this image itself. It's not what lockdown is, it's what it feels like to you personally. So I think that is extremely well done. It's as we go on, is trying to put that whole personal impact, personal touch onto the images we do, put ourselves into the photos. So here you've got the keys, the head and the hands, the sort of the struggle, the locked in, and the actual what it all, and the gloves and all the different symbols related to that. And you've got keys behind her as well. Possibly when you're looking at doing a triptych, just have a little bit more space between the images themselves, which separate them and makes each image stand out that little bit more from the actual surrounding images, that little bit more separation, room to breathe. But I really like it, and I hold that back. I think it's a really interesting detail you've seen here. The angle you've shot it at works really well with the leading line of the diagonal of the fence coming to it. The overall image feels pretty bright, and overall the tone feels even. So one thing to think about, how can you make that barrow stand out more? And I'd actually look at darkening the areas around it and then slightly lighting the barrow itself, and that will make it pop out more from the image itself. But I think it's an interesting viewpoint, interesting angle, which works effectively. 15.
Colin Rogers.
Here, it's once again, it's sort of the more documentary feel. What's lockdown like? What does it represent? One of the challenges of this competition is with camera clubs. It's very much one style of image. This would work much more in a panel of images or a book telling a story about something. Something to think about is, where do you want me to look at? Where do you want me to focus? What's the sharpest part of the image? The sharpest part of the image is here, which means my eye goes to there. The foreground feels quite soft. Is this important to you in the image? Do you want me to focus on this, or do you want my eye to go there? So it's just something to consider about in terms of, your eye goes to the sharpest part. What do you want the viewer to look at? Do you want them to look at elements? If so, that needs to be sharp. That needs to be sharp. 14. Here, very much, it's a very dramatic structure. There is some good texture in the actual rock and actually the heather or gorse or whatever the undergrowth is. I think the square crop works very well with the actual image itself. It does feel a little bit heavy in the mid-tones, and I wonder whether greater contrast would have actually benefited more and make it stand out more. One thing to be careful, however, of is over-sharpening. You've got very crispy lines around the mountains here. You've got very crispy lines here. The plants themselves look quite crispy as well. And actually, when things are over-sharpened, it can actually take away from the image itself. It starts feeling, it doesn't actually necessarily feel as real and believable as you'd expect to actually see it. But I think overall, I like the angle. I like how you've taken the rock at a diagonal, once again, sort of dynamic diagonal line. 16.
Ken McGrath.
Really attractive mountainous scene. I'm not sure where you've been, but I think it looks absolutely stunning. You've got good contrast in the image between the white and the dark. It creates a sense of depth where the mountains behind are that bit lighter than the mountains in the foreground, creating that sense of depth. And also the focus on those is softer than the ones in the foreground, creating depth through the depth of field as well. What I would look at is, are there things which are leading you out of the image? So you've got this light bit here, you've got a leading line and a light bit there. Where do you want me to look? Where do you want me to focus? You could almost crop off this element to the side here. You take away the light areas, and then that focus is very much on the water here in the foreground and the mountains. So it's something to think about. Where do you want me to look? Is this bit important to you? Do you want to include this? Or if you lost this little bit there, would it actually benefit the image in terms of actually focusing my attention more on the centre of on this bit here? 18.
Kevin Gilpin.
Okay. Here is you've got a selection of pots in a yard, some interesting light falling on them. It's quite abstract in nature. Whilst you've got a degree of dark and light, could you accentuate this any further by increasing the contrast to make it more, to make the actual darks darks and lights stronger and more contrasty. Also, could you actually, it's very much a pattern picture. If you actually cropped in more, would this, taking out some of the actual grass around, thinking about the more you have in the image, the more you actually dilute the impact. If you cropped in more, would this focus my attention more on all the shapes and patterns of the actual pots itself? Because is this area important? Does it tell the story? Do I actually need to look at it? Because it's there, I look at it. But if it was more, no, I can't even draw. If it was more there, then my attention wouldn't actually focus on this element. It would just focus more on the key pots in the middle of the actual image itself. 15.
Carolyn Phillips.
So this one, 20.
Colin Rogers.
20.
Khadija Wabi.
19.
Kirsty Railton.
19.
Carol Weatherly.
20.
Reg Haslam.
19.
Tina Cordukes.
And 20.
Gavin McBride.
Oh, sorry, score for that one, 19.
Reg Haslam. Yes, and then just a favourite for the whole competition, please. Or your winner for the competition.
Oh gosh, whole competition. I thought I was doing colour and mono. Okay, favourite for that's a challenge now. Favourite for whole competition, what I'd actually say is the Yashica camera.
Katie. Oh. Yashica camera. So that's the overall winner. That's lovely.
And now the scores table for the competition.
Oh.